just to briefly recap, Chapter 30, Fiscal Policy. We looked at fiscal policy in terms of an ASAD diagram, shifting the aggregate demand curve. There was a diagram that we went through that was new. Which was to plot government spending and taxes against output. Okay, and we saw that if, for example, our tax rate, right, or our taxes are earned via a tax rate, right, so that our tax revenues increase as output increases, whereas our government spending, for example, just stays the same, stays exogenous and stays independent of our y variable, then as output increases, in other words, as y goes up, our taxes go up, but government spending stays the same. We have a change in our budget balance, right? We can have, therefore, things like a cyclical deficit or a structural deficit, or a structural surplus, or a cyclical surplus. Okay? Otherwise, we saw how fiscal policy influences the aggregate demand side of the economy, which increases prices and increases output, but only temporarily. Our increase in government spending can increase output, but in order to increase output, what we need to rely on is the idea that our aggregate supply curve doesn't respond immediately to that increase in output and increase in prices. As soon as that supply curve responds to that increase in prices, shifts to the left, and we end up back at our potential. What changes? Well, when we increase government spending, we increase money demand, interest rates go up. That increase in interest rates essentially crowds out investment. So our increase in government spending is matched by a decrease in investment spending. Well, I say investment, but obviously it means any interest-sensitive expenditure. Investment is the one that we refer to most frequently. Okay. What's the adjustment process? Change in aggregate demand leads to change in prices. A change in prices leads to a change in real wages. When real wages change, we have a change in employment. Once laborers are able to make adjustments for that change in real wages adjust back to their original level, which shifts the aggregate supply curve, and we end up back at our long-run equilibrium. Okay? So that was the fiscal policy side of our ASAD model, which we finished up last week. This week, monetary policy, and we're going to do a similar analysis in the ASAD framework. But before we do that analysis, we're going to just kind of do a whole lot of theory, basically, right? Just discussions about the Reserve Bank in the South African context. After studying this chapter, what are you going to be able to do? Describe the objectives of South Africa's monetary policy, as well as framework for setting and achieving them. So what are our objectives? Explain the monetary policy instruments that the Reserve Bank uses and how they work together to influence the interest rates in the economy. Okay? So what are our Reserve Bank instruments and what do they affect? They affect interest rates. Explain the transmission channels through which the Reserve Bank influences real GDP and inflation. Okay, so transmission channels. Illustrate and discuss the effects of monetary policy action on interest rates, real GDP, and prices. Okay, so illustrate and discuss, that we'll spend a lot of time on, and that is kind of the way that we test you, I guess, is on this illustration and discussion of the whole process. Show graphically and explain how the Reserve Bank fights inflation. Okay, so again, illustrating and showing graphically. So all of these things we've kind of touched on in the course so far. We have dealt with these things along the way. We've seen graphically how changes in the money market influence things like real GDP as well as inflation and prices. Today we're just going to formalize that whole discussion within the context of an understanding of what the Reserve Bank does. Okay, so what are the objectives? Well, the primary objective is price stability. Achieve and maintain price stability. Okay, doesn't say it here, but it should. Price stability. Okay. And who does it? It's the South African Reserve Bank, or the SARB. The SARB is our monetary authority, and they're the ones that are in control of our monetary policy. Primary objective, price stability. Secondary objective? Anyone? Growth. Cool. Okay. So first, price stability, secondary objective, growth. Except at the moment, there is something else called financial stability. So in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, let's call it the financial crisis of most of the developed world, because it didn't affect everyone. But the financial crisis, in that wake, there's something called financial stability. And the debate and the discussion and the sort of the theory at the moment is maintaining price stability linked to maintaining financial stability? Does a focus on price stability automatically mean a focus on financial stability? Does a focus on price stability undermine a focus on financial stability? Should financial stability and price stability both be mandates of the Reserve Bank as two separate things? Okay, it's not clear at the moment. Certainly when the Reserve Bank, when the US Reserve Bank was created, which was in about 1913, and when our Reserve Bank was created, which was in about 1920, both of them had a mandate for financial stability. That mandate for financial stability slowly became price stability through inflation targeting. Right? Question now is, okay, how do we go back to financial stability? Because clearly just price stability is not enough to deal with financial stability. And financial stability is a problem. Let's work out what to do. Okay. Anyway, that's the current debate, financial stability. In the meantime, who is the South African Reserve Bank? As we've said before, it's not owned by the government. It's a private company, and it's owned by shareholders. Despite the fact that it's owned by shareholders, those shareholders have no control over the policies of the Reserve Bank. When I say no control, I'll describe what that means in a moment. They also don't have any kind of profit distribution. They get paid a fixed dividend, so the shares of the Reserve Bank trade at a price, and the fixed dividend divided by that price gives you some sort of a yield. And that yield ends up being about the same as the yield on a government bond. Why? Because owning a share in the Reserve Bank is pretty much the same as owning a government bond. You don't get any kind of special profits. Any profits from the Reserve Bank go to the Treasury, so they go to government anyway. Okay? Apart from obviously this dividend that they pay on an equity share in the Reserve Bank, which, as I say, is basically the same as a bond to the Reserve Bank. So you can hold equity, but it doesn't allow you any real share in profits, and it doesn't allow you any say in what happens. As a shareholder, you can elect governors to the board. Shareholders are allowed to elect, I think it's 6 of the 30, I think there's 13 governors, and the shareholders can elect 6 of them, and then essentially the government elects 7, right? So again, if government wants something that, and for some reason shareholders band together and say we don't want that, well, they're still going to be outvoted 7-6. So even if shareholders could in some way band together to try and influence policy, they don't have enough control of the board to do that. Okay? So they can't, shareholding, it's really just it's a symbolic thing, and what it symbolizes is that the Reserve Bank is independent of the executive. The executive makes decisions about fiscal policy, the Reserve Bank makes decisions about monetary policy, and the Reserve Bank decisions are independent of the executive. The executive, nevertheless, the executive being the president and his ministers, the executive does appoint the governor of the Reserve Bank. Okay, so the Reserve Bank is not totally independent of the executive. The governor is appointed by the executive. Okay, but ultimately, who makes policy for the Reserve Bank? It's in discussion with Parliament. So, in a sense, we decide what the mandate of the Reserve Bank is. If we are unhappy with it, we go through Parliament and we change that mandate. If we don't think that inflation targeting should be done, we go through Parliament, we can change the mandate of the Reserve Bank. That's how it works. Okay. How do we achieve price stability? The Reserve Bank uses the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, to determine whether the goal of price stability is achieved. And if it's not, what do? They adjust interest rates. To reduce the inflation rate successfully, the bank paid close attention to the CPI, excluding interest rates, which was called the CPIX. Okay, so CPI minus mortgage interest rates was called CPIX. The Reserve Bank used to target CPIX. It now targets CPI. In order to target CPI, it adjusts the interest rate. What is the role of the Reserve Bank? The monetary authority in South Africa is responsible for the conduct of monetary policy. What is the role of Parliament? There's a close collaboration between monetary and fiscal policy in South Africa, and an inflation targeting framework is used for conducting monetary policy. That framework, that inflation targeting framework, is decided by government in consultation with the Reserve Bank. So the role of Parliament is to consult with the Reserve Bank in order to determine what the framework for monetary policy will be. Our framework is an inflation targeting framework. And in terms of that framework, we target inflation, we target an inflation rate. Do you know what the rate is that we target? 5%, okay, close, yeah? Sorry? 7%. Close? 0, sorry? 7.5? A little bit further away, okay, getting colder. Yes, 6, okay, but it's in fact a little bit more nuanced than that. It's between 3 and 6%. Okay, so our target rate, what is the inflation target? It's 3 to 6%. So the Reserve Bank wants to keep inflation between 3 and 6%. Okay? Anyone know what our inflation rate is currently, approximately? Yeah? 6.5? Sounds about right, 6.5. Okay. Anyone know what the inflation target is of the US Fed? Yeah, it's around 2%, right? The UK? Also around 2%. Okay, so our inflation target is quite a lot bigger than some of the other developed economies that also have inflation targeting as a framework, which is interesting.
So why is ours so large?
I think it's primarily because of historical inflation generally. We've tended to have high inflation, and the idea was that targeting inflation between 3 to 6% was doable. Lower than that was not necessarily doable, and it was a case of saying, let's get it there first, and then if we can do that, then maybe we can also see whether we can get it lower, right?
So did it change at all when finance minister, the previous Pravin Gordhan,
Yes.
was it lower when he was in?
No, but Pravin Gordhan was in the Treasury, he wasn't at the SARB.
Oh, I see.
So currently the SARB is Kanyeho, what's his name? Oh man, I forget what his first name is. But anyway, I think it's Kanyeho. Anyway, and then before that was Jill Marcus, and before that was Tito Mboweni. So this inflation targeting, I think it was put in place with Tito. It might have been before, but I think it was with Tito. Lisette, how do I pronounce it? Sorry? Lasicha. Is that what it is? Okay, Lasicha. Kanyako. Yeah. I'll just embarrass myself if I carry on. Okay, cool. So that's our governor currently. What does the president do? Well, he's limited to appointing the governor and 3 deputy governors. Okay? And that's for a term of 5 years. Since 2000, South Africa has used inflation targeting. What is inflation targeting about? It's about achieving an explicit inflation target. So we said our target is 3 to 6%. And then, as part of that explicit inflation target, what the Reserve Bank needs to do in order to try and achieve that target is to explain how its policy is going to achieve that target. Okay? So in other words, a large part of the strategy for inflation targeting is communication. Whoa. Okay, so the Reserve Bank puts a lot of effort into communicating what it thinks inflation is going to do in the next couple of months up to the next couple of years, and then makes very clear what its strategy will be if inflation does do what it thinks inflation is going to do. It also suggests what its strategy will be if inflation doesn't do what it's going to do, right? And the whole idea of that is to make people aware of what to expect, so that as data comes in, when we see what that data is doing, we can say, right, this is what the data is doing, this is what the Reserve Bank said that they would do if the data was doing that, therefore we can expect the Reserve Bank to do what they said they would do. Okay? So that there's no big surprises, essentially. And the Reserve Bank's done a pretty good job of that. I think the last time there was a surprise in the Reserve Bank communication, in other words, there was a surprise change in the interest rate, was sometime, I think, in like 2012. And what happened was Stats SA compiles the data for the CPI, and they made a mistake. So they said CPI is the following, and then suddenly they went, oh wait, hang on a minute, sorry, we messed up the calculation, CPI is actually the following. And within, I think it was like within the next day, the Reserve Bank had an emergency meeting and made an announcement and changed the interest rate. And that was unexpected. Yeah. Well, the role of the Reserve Bank would be not to allow hyperinflation. I mean, that's, if there's hyperinflation, then the Reserve Bank is not achieving its target, right? But the idea would be, if you've got prices that are escalating, right, at a fast rate, the way that you address that is with high interest rates. So you would expect, for example, if there was high inflation, to see high interest rates. That's about all the Reserve Bank can do. Hyperinflation. Usually, though, when you look at examples of economies that have experienced hyperinflation, it's usually because the Reserve Bank is printing money to finance government spending. So there tends to be no separation between the goal of the Reserve Bank and the executive. In other words, the executive basically takes control over what the Reserve Bank does and prints money to finance its expenditure. In printing that money drives the inflation. In printing the money, then it also drives interest rate. It puts down pressure on interest rates, right? So you lose control of the mechanism required to control inflation, and that's why you have hyperinflation, because the Reserve Bank is not functioning appropriately in order to address that. And then you have a collapse of the money supply. And then your only real solution thereafter is to basically reinvent your money supply and change your policies and stop the executive just printing cash to do what it wants. Okay, how is inflation targeting conducted? Inflation targets are specified in terms of a range of the CPI inflation rate. The aim is to achieve an average inflation rate. No, that's not the South African context. Okay, it's an average inflation rate of 3 to 6%. What does inflation targeting achieve? It states clearly and publicly the goals of monetary policy. It establishes a framework of accountability. In other words, you can check. Monetary policy, the Reserve Bank has said this is what they will do if we see the following. Are they doing that? Okay? It's very easy to hold the Reserve Bank accountable under those circumstances. And number 3, it keeps the inflation rate low and stable while maintaining high and stable level of employment. So this is the secondary mandate, right? High and stable level of employment. So if inflation is under control, then the Reserve Bank should be trying to ensure that the economy is also growing well. But it doesn't have a lot of scope for that, so that's its secondary mandate. Inflation targeting in South Africa. How does this work? Number 1, we make monetary policy clear in order to improve the planning and decision making of both the private and the public sector. Number 2, part of a coordinated approach to reduce inflation in order to promote high and sustainable economic growth and employment. Number 3, focus monetary policy and improve the accountability of the Reserve Bank. Number 4, it guides inflation expectations, so that's important, expectations, and thus price and wage setting behavior of economic agents. Okay? So hopefully, given the discussions we've had so far in the course about how wages are set in terms of expectations of price level and inflation, you see that the Reserve Bank has a very important role in influencing those expectations by making public what the current state of CPI is, what it expects CPI to be, what it anticipates in terms of the data, and how it plans to react. All of those things shape people's expectations. Okay? Remember, why is it important to shape those expectations? Because you want those expectations to be as accurate as possible to prevent business cycle swings. In other words, inflation because we've got an inflationary output gap, or unemployment because we've got a recessionary output gap. We want to keep people near full employment, right? Expectations, if expectations are incorrect, we can move away from full employment. That's the kind of the framework in which we're operating here. So, how does the Reserve Bank do this? In other words, control inflation. It has monetary policy instruments. A monetary policy instrument is a variable that the Reserve Bank can control directly or at least very closely. What's its primary instrument? Well, we have the repo rate. Okay, so number 1, the repo rate. The repo rate works through the refinancing system. In other words, the refinancing system refers to the way in which a central bank extends credit to commercial banks that are short of cash reserves. The cost at which a bank the repo rate, is the cost at which the bank obtains liquidity from the Reserve Bank. It's referred to as the repurchase rate or the repo rate. In order to achieve a liquid shortage, the Reserve Bank uses 2 or more instruments, usually the repo rate and either cash reserve requirements or open market operations. So what is the repo rate? The Reserve Bank says, if you are short, it says to the commercial banking system, if you are short of cash reserves, okay, so at the end of the day, you need to keep a certain amount of your deposits on reserve in cash at the Reserve Bank. If you do not have enough cash and you are not able to borrow cash from another commercial bank that has excess cash, you can borrow the cash directly from us. If you borrow that cash directly from us, we will charge you an interest rate. That interest rate is called the repo rate. Okay? In South Africa, we also have like an interesting quirk, which other countries don't have. We have something called the repo rate, whatever the Reserve Bank sets that at, plus 3.5%, and that gives you something called the prime interest rate. So when you want to go to the bank to borrow, you will usually get something like a rate that's quoted as the following: prime plus 2 or prime minus 1, right? What that means is that the commercial bank will charge you whatever the repo rate is plus 3.5% plus some adjustment factor in terms of your risk profile, right? So, sorry? What about it? Just is. There's, as I say, it's just like a quirk of our system. There's no, I don't know why it's plus 3.5%. It just, there is a thing called prime that we work off, and prime is taking the repo rate and adding 3.5%, right? So whereas another country you might get a variable interest rate which is quoted as repo plus some percentage, we have prime plus some percentage. Or, well, prime is fixed in terms of the difference between prime and the repo rate. But if the repo rate changes, then prime changes. Okay? So if the repo rate is 6%, the prime rate is 9.5%. If the repo rate is 7%, the prime interest rate is 10.5%. Okay? I mean, you could look at it like that if you wanted to, sure. Is it a case of the commercial banking system just milking? Well, remember that there's something called risk which the bank has to deal with. So you can get prime, you can get prime minus 1% and you can get prime plus 2%. All it really is the difference between the repo rate and the rate that the bank charges you, and the size of that is related to the risk that the bank incurs by holding you on its balance sheet. Yeah.
Is the South African, what the standard South African profile, the risk, like risky, like for most people risky?
So yields on government bonds, for example, are around 7.5%, I think. And a yield on a government bond gives you an indication of the country risk. Okay? So you would then expect the sort of average citizen to be reflective of that average risk. You know what I mean? And 7.5% on a South African government bond versus, I think you get about 1% on a US Treasury. That gives you an idea of how risky we are relative to, say, the US. And I think you get about maybe 1.5% on a UK Treasury. So yeah, we are considered much more risky than other places in the world, but then again, there are places in the world that have higher interest rates than us. So. Okay, so instrument number 1, repo rates. Instrument number 2, the cash reserves. A cash reserve requirement, sorry. Anyone else got any other questions about that? No? Okay. We know from previously that the cash reserve requirement compels banks to keep a certain percentage of their deposits in an account at the central bank. And if a bank experiences an increase in its deposits, it is also required to keep more reserves. Anyone know what that required percentage is at the moment? 7. Is it 7? No. The required reserve percentage. I think it's about 2%, something like that. It's pretty small. Okay, and then open market operations. The Reserve Bank either purchases or sells government securities to or from commercial banks and the public. Okay, so we did discuss open market operations when we discussed the money market. But just as a recap, what happens if the Reserve Bank wants to increase money supply, okay, and it wants to use open market operations to do that, the way it does it is to purchase bonds from the market. When it purchases bonds from the market, it pays for those bonds with cash. right? Which means it's taking bonds out of the market and putting cash into the market. It's injecting cash. That's how it increases the money supply in the market, by taking bonds away and putting cash in. Okay? That's how it would change the money supply through an open market operation. The reverse would be wants to take cash out of the market, right? How does it take cash out of the market? By selling bonds. When it sells a bond, people pay for that bond with cash, right? Which means cash goes out of the market, bonds go in. The Reserve Bank takes cash out of the economy. Yeah.
What happens when people don't trust the market and are willing to hold on to cash and not buy the bonds?
That's an interesting question. Okay, what happens when the transmission mechanism, the open market operation, in a sense, breaks down because people don't want to hold government bonds? Okay, you don't trust the government, you think they're going to default, whatever the case may be. So rather than holding a bond, you just want to hold cash. Okay? Then what you end up with is, and I think in the chapter 29 appendix handout, right? So remember in the ISLM, there was that photocopied addition to the appendix. In that appendix section, you can go and take a look, but essentially it refers to two different situations, and you get something called a liquidity trap. And a liquidity trap, essentially you have the money supply controlled by the Reserve Bank, and money demand is independent of the interest rate. Okay? Doesn't matter what the interest rate is, people just hold money. So the Reserve Bank tries to increase money supply. Okay? It doesn't change the interest. It can't change the interest rate to change money supply, right? In other words, it can't try and buy bonds influencing interest rates and therefore get people to hold more money, right? Because the interest rate doesn't change. So it needs to somehow get money into the economy some other way, right? But once it's got that money into the economy, the only thing that happens is people just hold on to it. Okay? So, open market operations don't work when you have a liquidity trap. And liquidity trap is where people just hold any amount of money, right? Any money you give them, they just hold it. We're not investing this. We don't care what the interest rate is. I'm holding money. Okay? So that usually occurs that's the kind of thing that would occur primarily if you have like deflation, right? Because when you have deflation, prices are going down, which means the value of the money that you're holding is going up, right? So the value of the money that you're holding is going up. You've essentially got a riskless investment that's increasing in value over time. Why would you buy a government bond when you've already got something that's riskless and increasing in value, right? Why would you want to invest in a company and earn a return when you've got an asset that already earns a return? Because prices are decreasing, right? So it's not something that happens usually, but it's a question of saying, what happens when interest rates drop so low, right, that, even though you've dropped interest rates so low, people are still holding cash, is another way that situation can arise, right? So in, I think it's Switzerland, is it Switzerland or Sweden? One of those two, they've got negative interest rates at the moment. Question is like, what does negative interest rates mean? Like, can you conduct monetary policy with negative interest rates? Well, we're finding out now, at this point, how well monetary policy works when you have negative interest rates. Okay, so open market operations is the third way in which monetary policy, the third tool in the toolbox of the Reserve Bank for conducting monetary policy. So how does the Reserve Bank make its decision? Well, it looks at the inflation rate, and the Reserve Bank forecasts the inflation rate. And those forecasts are a crucial ingredient in its interest rate decision. Okay? So it looks at the inflation rate, it says what do we expect inflation to be doing, and then we adjust our interest rate accordingly. Okay? So the Reserve Bank looks at, number one, the inflation rate, but also looks at something like the output gap. Because remember, its secondary mandate is growth. So the output gap, if you have an inflationary gap, the output gap is positive, the inflation rate will most likely accelerate. So what is the Reserve Bank going to do? It's going to increase interest rates, higher interest rates. Okay? You might, however, have stable inflation, but you have a recessionary gap. In other words, prices are not falling, but output is falling. So if you have a recessionary gap, then the output gap is negative. Inflation might ease, usually it doesn't, because wages tend to be quite sticky. But the Reserve Bank still therefore has room to lower the interest rates in order to boost aggregate demand and try and increase output. Usually if you have a recessionary gap and you increase output, you don't have inflation, because what tends to happen is when you look at the way the economy works and you have output and prices, if you have some level here being the long run aggregate supply, in other words, this is our potential output, right? So potential. What tends to happen is your short run aggregate supply curve looks steep like this and pretty flat like that, right? So below potential, it's quite flat, and above potential, it's quite steep. So what tends to happen if you have aggregate demand shifting to the left, you have a very small change in prices, right? In other words, when you have a recessionary gap, it doesn't tend to be met with much deflation, right? So as the Reserve Bank, with expansionary monetary policy, you can shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, increasing output with very little inflationary effect. That's how it tends to operate. Okay. What are the transmission channels? In other words, how is it that when the Reserve Bank changes the interest rate, it affects the economy? What happens? Well, there are three channels through which a change in the repo rate influences aggregate demand and therefore inflation. What are those three channels? We've got this diagram from your text. Now let's just zoom in a bit. Okay? When the Reserve Bank changes the repo rate, it affects the rate at which banks borrow and lend money. Right? So it affects the rates at which the rates that banks charge and the rates that they pay on deposits. It also affects any other kinds of interest rates which are usually linked to the bank interest rates. In other words, interest rates on any other kind of bond instruments. So government yields change, yields on commercial debt changes, any other interest rates other than bank rates also change. Okay, so but that's a second channel to the banking channel. Then there's a third channel in which the repo rate affects output, and that's through the exchange rate. When the Reserve Bank changes the interest rate in South Africa, it changes the yield on South African debt instruments. That also changes the yield on our instruments relative to debt instruments from anywhere else in the world, right? In other words, if South African bonds pay 6% yield and American bonds pay 1%, the difference between that yield is 5%, right? If the Reserve Bank suddenly changes interest rates to 7%, that yield differential increases. That change in differential then encourages foreign investors to buy our bonds, right? Because now you can get a better interest rate in South Africa relative to the US. That encourages people to buy our debt instruments. When people demand our bonds, it affects our exchange rate. So, chapter 26, the thing that we will be doing after this chapter 31, we'll be discussing more these changes in exchange rate that I'm briefly mentioning now. So those are your three channels. The repo rate has three channels, 1, 2, 3. Okay? Both channels 1 and 2 affect consumption and investment. Channel 2, this one, it's primarily investments. And number 3, the exchange rate channel affects imports and exports. So consumption, investments, imports and exports, obviously all of those affect aggregate demand. Okay, so when the Reserve Bank changes interest rates, it affects aggregate demand, and there are three channels in which that change in interest rates is transmitted into the economy generally. Okay? So you have the bank credit transmission channel, number 1. You have the interest rate transmission channel, number 2. And then number 3, Then number 3, you have the exchange rate transmission channel. What is the actual process? And I will, let me just check something quickly. Yeah, we'll take a break now. What is the actual transmission process? When the Reserve Bank lowers the repo rate, short-term interest rates and lending rates fall and the rand depreciates. The quantity of money and the supply of loanable funds increase. The long-term real interest rate falls, and the lower real interest rate increases consumption, expenditure, and investment. The weaker exchange rate makes South African exports cheaper and imports more costly. Okay, that's the summary of what's going on. And here we have that as a diagram. Okay, so we will begin once again after the break. We'll take a 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back, just quickly recap that.